I heard a couple of different answers to that question. I won't say who, but the first person I asked about the chili said, my wife. And I said, why is your wife's chili the best? And he said, well, I have to say that. That's very honest. Yeah, good answer, I thought. It's not a matter of what's in it. And then I was talking to Chris just now, and this is really interesting. Chris is trying to reverse engineer, is it your father's? Her father's chili. He didn't leave a recipe. And so her and her family are trying to figure out what went into the chili to make it so good, that signature taste. And that, I should have just talked to Chris beforehand, because that is an excellent analogy for what I want to share and talk about today. Reverse engineering discipleship and what it means to be called. And I want to look at the first disciples. So I know we don't always do this, but there are, if you brought a Bible, take that Bible out and turn to Luke 5. But if you didn't bring a Bible, let's be people of the Word. There's Bibles under every chair. So I know it's asking a lot. I don't always bring my Bible too, and I get a little antsy about using the stock Bible. But if you don't have your Bible with you, share, read over, peek on the person next to you. But we're looking at Luke 5. I'm going to read. Let's read a little bit of this together. I'll read. You follow along with your finger. Let's start at Luke 5:5. So the setting is this: Jesus has just finished teaching a crowd at the Lake Gennesaret, which is another name for the Sea of Galilee. And Simon and James and John have boats down there, and so Jesus hops into one of the boats. And he hops into the boat, and at first Jesus is teaching from the shore, but then he kind of finishes with the crowd, and he asks Simon to push out further. So that's where we're reading from. And he says to Simon, Simon, you know this story. Simon, put out your nets, put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch. And Simon says, Master, we've worked hard all night, haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets. When they had done so, they caught such a large catch, a large number of fish, that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partner. It took 2 boats to get these fish in. You know the story. But the part that I'm interested in, something you may not know, is that this is actually likely, we don't know for sure, but likely one of Jesus' first encounters with Simon. You may know him better as Peter. This story ends with these words. I want to play a trick on you here. I want to see if you notice. I'll tell you what it is later. But the story ends like this. They put down the nets. They have such a large catch, they need 2 boats to bring it in. And the text says they pulled up their boats onto the shore and they followed him. Same chapter. If you're following along, this is the calling of Levi. So we're looking at call narratives. Jesus' very first disciples. Before he was popular, Jesus' first disciples. And so we're looking at Levi, chapter 27. Basically, the story is this. Jesus comes up to Levi. Levi's a tax collector. You can imagine this very public setting. Levi's sitting down sort of at his tax booth, and people are coming to him to pay taxes. And he's taking money, but the text says this: Jesus went out and saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting at his tax booth, and he simply says, "Follow me." And Levi got up. The text says Levi got up and followed him. Right? So what I want to know, let me tell you a story. When I was 11 years old, we used to go to my grandmother's house a lot. And on nights when we would stay in town, we would eat at grandma's. And I would always hurry through the meal. The reason I would hurry through the meal is because there was something going on. I knew it was going on every week. And so I would slip out as early as I could. I'd do up the dishes. This was before dishwashers. Actually, it was after dishwashers, but my grandmother still wanted us to do dishes by hand. But I slipped out after the meal, and I walked the block, and there was a green space. Beautiful green space. And next to the green space, there was a bench like this. And I sat on the bench. I was watching a football game. Happened every week. These older boys, these high school boys were playing football. It was exciting. I watched them zig and zag. I watched them throw a football farther than I thought footballs could be thrown at the time. And I watched every detail. And I was really close. I specifically chose this bench because they would take their coats and their extra garments and they throw them not far from the bench. And so I figured, man, if I got a chance to get in this game, it's right here. So I would sit and I would watch, and I studied that game inside and out. I knew the rules. Even before I watched football on TV, I never played football, but I knew I wanted to play. I was 11 years old. But the obvious thing, what I thought was the obvious thing, never happened. None of those older boys ever swaggered over to my bench and took me by the hand and the shoulder and pulled me into the game. Didn't happen. And so when I read about these first call narratives, about Levi and about Simon Peter, the thing that interests me is, why them? What's special about them? Why are they qualified to be Jesus' disciples? What abilities or extraordinary skills did they bring to the mission? What does it really take to follow Jesus? That's what interests me. Maybe something else catches you, but that's what catches me. And so I want to look at three things. Three things that they did. Not self-help points, but just three observations, and I want to attach three questions to these three observations for us. And hopefully, it will help us grow as disciples. The first thing is they were willing to learn from Jesus and ask questions. This may not be readily apparent from the text as you read it, but we have to know something about the Jewish educational system in order to understand this. Jewish education at the time was tiered, much as it is now. You have elementary school, high school, college. And so from 0 to 6 years old, kids stayed at home. After 6, they enrolled in Bet Sefer, which literally means house of the book. They would meet at the local synagogue and they would study. The chief mechanism for study was memorization. And so they would take the Old Testament, they only had the Old Testament at the time, and they would literally memorize large swaths of the Old Testament. That's it. Little arithmetic, little writing, little reading. That's it. Roughly 6 years of age to 12, they were at the house of the book working with the local synagogue teacher. If they were good enough, if they showed interest, if they memorized enough, if it seemed likely that they could become a teacher themselves one day, they would move on to Bet Talmud. Talmud literally means learning. So you have the house of the book and the house of learning. And so from the age of 12 to 14, they would complete their Torah memorization. They had most of the Old Testament memorized. Remember, this is an oral culture. Maybe they can read, maybe not, but they memorized this book. But they would add to that. They would add some dialectics, some Socratic methods, some question and answer. And so the rabbi would ask them a question and they would respond, and vice versa. That's why as you read through the life of Jesus and his teaching, he's always answering questions from his disciples, from other Pharisees and teachers, from women at wells. It's part of who he is, and it's part of the educational system of the time. In fact, in Luke, you can look at, on your own time, look in Luke 2. Jesus, you know the story, was left in the temple. Mary and Joseph were doing in Jerusalem for an annual festival, and they left him there. And when they went back, they found him doing what? Do you remember? Yeah, his Father's work. Someone said preaching. More specifically, it says this. In 3 days, they found him in the temple court, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking questions. Well, that's not random. That's the education of the time. That's Bet Talmud. And then the third stage, if you were showing particular promise, if you had your Torah memorized, if you were a cut above your peers, if you wanted it, you would go on to Bet Midrash, which means study. And it's slightly different depending on the region, but in general, you would seek out a rabbi, a teacher, and you would say, Rabbi, I want to be your Talmid, your disciple. And if you were good enough, if the rabbi thought that his particular interpretation of Scripture, his Midrash, could be passed on to you and that you would be a good representative, he said yes. And if he didn't, he said no. So when we come to Levi at his tax booth, and when we come to Simon Peter in his boat, we know something already, which is that they're tradesmen. At any point in that educational system, if they're not good enough, they go back to the trades. So we know this already. They were tradesmen. Maybe they quit themselves. Maybe they were cut. Maybe they approached a particular teacher and they said no. We don't quite know. But we know that on some level, they were passed over. They were second string. They were deep in the bench. I have a friend who I used to converse with often. Always asked me, maybe you have a friend like this. Always used to ask me deep philosophical questions, and I would always pretend to know the answers. But we would have these long back and forths about whatever, philosophy, religion, life. And I remember one time in particular, we had been arguing for hours, and he finally said, just tell me this. Just simply tell me this. What does it take to be a Christian? And I don't remember what I said to him, but I do remember the weight of a missed opportunity. I do remember that whatever I said, it was weighing on me. It wasn't quite right, and so I went to my mentor, also named Dave, and I sort of burst in the door and I said, and Dave was sitting at his desk unpacking some books. He had this box and it was full of packing peanuts and he was pulling out books. And I said, Dave, question for you. Just tell me simply this. What does it take to be a Christian? Dave took his box and he flipped it upside down and he dumped all the packing peanuts all over the floor, which I thought was a bit dramatic. But I said, okay, you've got my interest at least. And he said nothing. He showed me the inside of the box and he said nothing. Doesn't take much of anything to be a Christian. And then he gestured towards me with the box, and he said, just the box. So at this third level, this Bet Midrash, it's just the box. You follow a rabbi in life. It's not just about what you can memorize or store in your mind. It's not just about the questions you can ask and the theological interpretations you can offer. It's about following somebody with your life. And Levi and his tax booth and Simon Peter in his boat on some level had been passed over. They weren't quite good enough. They weren't chosen at the very least. Number one, they were willing to learn from Jesus and follow him when he called. Question I think might be helpful for us, and I know is for me, is are we? Sometimes I know for me, my orientation to following Jesus is up here. Are we willing to learn? Are we willing to ask questions? Are there questions you think your God can't handle? Number two, they were willing to give Jesus everything. I left out two words. From the text. You might have known. A lot of you are very astute. I know Jim in particular. I've been in a Bible study with Jim. Jim reads Scripture like a scientist. He reads every word, and he asks hard questions, and he notices anything that's left out. But I left out 2 words. The text actually says at the end of the first story about Simon Peter, bring in the fish, too much for one boat. 2 boats come in, and they were so amazed. They pulled their boats onto shore, and here's what I left out. They left everything and followed him. Okay. Except a few verses later, same story about Levi at the tax booth, and I left out the same 2 words. It says that Levi got up, left everything. You'll know, you can read it yourself right there in Luke 5, and followed him. And this pattern repeats throughout the Gospels. I've got a list here. I was just making a list as I was going through Luke only. Susanna, Andrew, James, Joanna, John, Philip, Matthew, Nathaniel, Thomas, Mary Magdalene. All of Jesus' disciples end up leaving something behind, putting it on the line in order to follow him. Some don't, by the way. As you read the Gospels, you'll hear a few stories. For example, Jesus was walking on the road, and a man walks up to him and he says, Jesus, wherever you will go, I will go. And Jesus replies with a certain candor. He says, I have no place, the Son of Man has no place to rest his head. Essentially, he's saying, I'm homeless. We don't hear anything more from that man. A little while later, he says, there's another prospective disciple who says, Jesus, I'll follow you. First, let me go and bury my father and my mother, which is first century Jewish idiom for let me take care of my parents through the end of their life. Not a bad thing. Something about that. Jesus has a way of putting his finger on the things that we're least willing to part with in order to follow him. It's not the same for everybody. Moving forward, in Luke 18, the wealthy young ruler, the rich young ruler, the landowner, comes to Jesus and says, how do I experience eternal life? Mike, you've been reading Radical. I think it's cropped up in there so far as I've read, right? And you know the story. It's familiar to you. The rich young ruler says, Jesus says, follow the commandments. He says, I followed the commandments. Jesus says, sell everything you have and follow me. Couldn't do it. Jesus knows us. He knows me. He knows you. He knows the things we're least willing to part with. It's not that necessarily that he would even ask us to part with them. Maybe, but maybe not. Maybe it wasn't even about that money for the rich young ruler. Maybe it was simply about trusting God and being willing to put anything and everything that we have or think we have at his disposal for the building of his kingdom. Number 1, they were willing to learn from Jesus and ask questions. Number 2, they were willing to give Jesus everything. They left everything. This morning, I was standing in front of the mirror and I was trimming my beard. I have a wall beard trimmer. I was thinking about the sermon. I was trying to work some pieces out in my head, and I was thinking about this idea of what are the things in my life that I'm least willing to part with? And so I'm going through a list. My car, my money. Are there people I'm not willing to spend time with? Are there places I'm not willing to go? And I'm trimming my beard, and I don't know why I thought of this. I'm probably a little bit crazy, but I thought, what about my hair? Now, for the record, I don't think Jesus called me to shave my head. I don't think he's calling you to shave your head. Well, maybe some of you. But the point for me was, I hesitated. I stopped and I thought, I don't want to do that. No, probably that would be an inconvenience. I would use my interpretive lenses to somehow rationalize that away if Jesus actually called me to shave my head for some reason. What are the things that you aren't willing to part with in order to follow Jesus? They were willing to learn from Jesus and ask questions. They were willing to give Jesus everything. And finally, number 3, they were willing to follow. I think this gets overlooked. At least it did when I read through the passage. I think we overlook the fact that his disciples actually used their own 2 legs and followed Jesus wherever he went. If we put on our textual critics' lenses, if you borrow some literary acuity from a Bill Truesdale, and you really read this text with a critical lens, you'll figure something out. I stumbled on this almost by accident. But in between these 2 call narratives, Simon Peter and Levi, where they left everything and followed him, there's actually 2 other stories of healing. One in which Jesus heals a leper. And the second story, though, of healing, Jesus is teaching, and the crowds are so thick that this group of folks with their friend who's a paraplegic on a stretcher can't get through. And so you know the story, they lower him through the roof. Jesus heals him. And the Pharisees get upset, they always do. But this is how this story ends. It says this: they were filled with awe and said, "We have seen remarkable things today." We have seen remarkable things today. I don't know the hearts of the people in that particular crowd, the hearts of the Pharisees. I don't know what God was doing in their life. But I think it's interesting that we have a story of call where Simon gives up everything and follows him, Simon and Andrew. And we have a story of call with Levi where Levi gets up and leaves everything to follow Jesus. And then in the middle, it says we have Pharisees coming from Jerusalem, Galilee, and Judea, as far as Judea. Educated people, qualified people. People, we might say, who would be more likely than these tradesmen to follow Jesus. And it's not that what the text says is bad. They were filled with awe and said, "We have seen remarkable things today." But it does strike you, doesn't it? Because there's no action. There's no verb after it. They don't do anything. They just watch. They listen to Jesus, and they do nothing. Maybe in the end, some did follow. Maybe not. That actually reminds me, raise your hand if you've seen The Passion of the Christ. Yeah, so I was walking out of The Passion of the Christ, Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, for the first time. And I don't know what I was feeling. You know what I mean? It's an emotional movie, right? It's powerful on some level. It rocks you a little bit, viscerally. And so I was walking out of the theater, and I heard this from a lady, and I don't know why it irritated me so much, but it did. I was walking out of the theater, and I hear this: "That was such a nice movie." Quoting verbatim. And I'm like welling up inside. I'm thinking to myself, that was a lot of things, but it wasn't a nice movie. You've just seen the story of what it takes for God to be with His creation and to save us. It's not a nice... And so when I read this passage in the middle of the 2 call narratives, that's how I read it. That's my interpretive lens. I'm willing to be wrong, but listen how similar it does sound. They were filled with awe and said, "We have seen remarkable things today." It even sounds incomplete. There's something missing. They were willing to follow, to actually follow. Are we willing to follow? So, sitting on the bench watching the football game, and nobody ever came. Week after week, I would go and I would sit on the bench, and nobody ever came over and asked me to play. I was 11 years old, and these older boys were playing a lively game of football. And eventually, it occurred to me like a bird hitting a window what was missing. And so I went home to grandmother's house, and I went into the basement. I went into the basement of my grandmother's house, and like a good archaeologist, I uncovered some really interesting artifacts. But I knew the thing I was looking for, and so I'm digging around there, and I finally found it. I found the thing that would take me from fan to fullback. These people saw me as a spectator, but I found the thing that was going to change all that. And so I kind of sort of heaved it up. It was pretty heavy, and I had about a block and a half to walk. But I carried that. I was wearing just a plain T-shirt and red cotton shorts. But I carried that all the way to the field, and I sat down, and I put it on. A 1980s pro-size Green Bay Packer football helmet. And I sat there, and I waited. 1 minute. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Nobody ever swaggered over to the side of the field, grabbed my hand and shoulder, and pulled me into the game. Nobody ever said, "We want him," or even, "Let's give the kid a try." It hurt. But the church, unlike that green space near my grandmother's house, is a place where nobody has to ride the bench. Everybody plays. Everybody is needed. Everyone has a call on their life. We move forward together not because I'm so smart or you're so wonderful, or because any of us have all the answers, but because we believe in a God who is in the business of doing great things with ordinary people. Are you willing to enter into an ongoing dialogue with your God and your community and learn from Jesus? Are there things you are holding back that if through prayerful discernment you felt God telling you to give up, donate, contribute, borrow, use, you, like the rich young ruler, would go away depressed and dejected? Are you willing to actually go and actually do? Are you willing to get off the bench?